Good evening, New Orleans, and welcome to Inside New Orleans Sports. I'm your host, Eric Asher. Over the next hour, we're going to get the latest on the New Orleans Saints, and we're going to look back at 50 years of New Orleans Saints football. To break it down for us, Mike Detillier of WWL Radio. Mike, welcome back to the show.
My pleasure,
Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us, and I'm looking forward to a really fun hour. We'll kind of get the business out of the way first, talk a little bit about as the Saints are finished with minicamp. We're just a few weeks from training camp. We'll kind of get your impressions of what you saw during the minicamp and OTAs, and then we're going to talk a little bit about your memories, our memories of 50 years of Saints football. And you got some great stories too, not just stories obviously of your knowledge and life revolving around Saints football, but you were right next to a guy named Buddy D, and y'all had a lot of great memories together.
We don't have enough time on the show to do all that.
Right.
We'd have to do a mini series on that.
We might do that one day. That's for sure. But let's kick it off. Let's start before we get rolling here. Talk a little bit about your role at WWL, some of the other shows you're doing around the country, and if you would tell the folks about your website where folks can find out all about your guide, your draft guide, and everything else. Mike Detillier.
Man, listen. Come football season, it's an easy click. Monday mornings, Friday mornings, before and after games, certainly during the pregame shows, and we do our show out on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and Bobby and I have a good time doing that on the Big 870 and man, radio stations. I could go on and on and on. And certainly part of the LSU radio network too, and doing the pregame network for them. So I do 14 more. So it's busy time of the year, but you know what? I enjoy doing it, and so. One click of the dial and you can hear me.
You can find him somewhere. I told you before, I think we said it last time, maybe the time before you were on, 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm listening to the radio, get ready to go to bed, and there's Mike Detillier coming on the radio. You telling me sometimes you're doing that live.
Some of it was live. They were I was supposed to do it the night after, but the guest skipped out, so he calls me up. He says, you need to get up for a little while. I said, no, I'm good. I do a lot of these shows from the bed. I can handle this. You just throw it. And so, we've done some of them 1:30, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. I guess the most memorable one, and everybody brings it up, the night Katrina passed. My telephone still was working. Cell and my regular line, and I was on with ESPN Bristol.
Wow.
4 different segments. That didn't last too long, but we did it basically from almost 2 o'clock in the morning till like 6:30 in that morning. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, it's amazing. Amazing time. Amazing. Again, almost 11 years now post Katrina. Mike, let's kick in. Let's talk a little bit about what you saw as the minicamp has ended. We're just a few weeks from training camp. What did you see during the minicamp? What stuck out to you?
What stuck out with me is this team's going to score a lot of points. And the negative is this team's going to give up a lot of points. Bottom line. What you looked at a year ago is what you're going to see again. I think you're a little bit better on defense. But, Eric, you don't have an edge pass rusher. And we brought this up on an earlier show that I thought that was the big part of maybe the improvement on this team. Stephon Anthony, Haloi Kakaha, P.J. Williams, who was impressive in the practice session, very much. Hopefully Damian Swan could stay healthy. And then you add in Sheldon Rankins, Von Bell, Eric Harris, and you think you made a little bit of an upgrade. Then you lose Kakaha. So where's your edge pressure going to come from now? The craziest thing, and I tell this to people all the time, the position with the most depth is defensive tackle. Just think about it. You have John Jenkins, Sheldon Rankins, Nick Fairley, David Onyemata. And Tyler Davidson. You got 5 guys there that can play in the NFL one way or another, situational or not. Man, you wish you had that depth all over. It's just not there. I still wonder, and you can't tell this by the practice sessions, how well this team's going to match up downfield with a running back and a tight end. A lot of teams took great advantage. You just look at the numbers tight ends did against New Orleans last year. It was unbelievable. And where's your pressure going to come from? I continually beat the drum on this, and I've said it for so many years now. In the NFL, first 2 things. You better have a quarterback. You got one. Secondly, you better have some people that can put that other quarterback on his keister, and you don't have it.
Mike, a lot has been talked about as minicamp closed by the New Orleans media about the linebacker position. Nate Stupar coming over from Atlanta, Craig Robinson coming over from Cleveland, obviously James Laurinaitis coming over from St. Louis / Los Angeles. Did you see an upgrade when you saw the mini camps in maybe the speed of the linebackers, their ability to cover? It's hard to judge a linebacker when they're in shorts and T-shirts, but just your overall thoughts, just maybe on the athleticism and speed.
Smarts.
Okay.
Okay. You look at Stupor, Robertson, Laurinaitis, played in this league. They know what they're doing. Last year, you had a bunch of guys that really had not played, inexperienced. So what I saw was the intelligence level, not making the mental mistakes. Now, here's the big part. Can they translate that into making plays out on the field? You know, certainly you know what you get with Laurinaitis. He's a first, second down guy that'll be good against the run. Craig Robinson's a guy that's played all over the board, solid. Nate Stupor's basically been a special teams guy, occasional, you know, he's your insurance policy. And I think that's basically what you got here. So you've upgraded the area talent-wise, no question. But where you've really upgraded the intelligence part of the linebacking core, you got to know what you're doing. If you don't, you lost. I don't care how fast you are, how strong you are, all this other stuff, athletically, you got to know what you're doing out on the field. But again, I go right back to it. You are razor thin at cornerback, razor thin. And that defensive end, I don't know if you can get any thinner. And who's going to take that spot of Haloi Kakaha off the edge? Davis Tull, you would hope maybe he'd be the guy. He's a guy in less than a year. He's had 2 shoulder injuries, left and right. Can he stay healthy? Obum Gwachum's interesting. He looks the part.
Gained some weight, right?
He gained some weight.
Right.
He looks the part. But you got to also remember, if you know his background, he came in, Mike Riley told me, I recruited him as a receiver, and he played there for 2 years. He was just a defensive lineman for the last 2 years at Oregon State. So he's still a football puppy using his hands. You got to know how to use your hands. I want to see that in a real game. I really believe you will see Nick Fairley put on the edge. I think in some situations, you've got no choice but to put Nick out of defensive end and see how well he can handle that. Because I think ideally you would like to have John Jenkins, Sheldon Rankins, first, second down inside. On third down, then I want Nick on the field because he gives you some pass rush that Jenkins is not going to give you.
What about the addition of Roman Harper? What do you think he brings to this club? As we've mentioned on this program, as we've mentioned on the radio show, it looks as though Sean Payton has already said it's fait accompli. He's going to make the team. He will be with the team in some capacity after he retires. What do they expect of him? What do you think is going to happen in terms of packages, how they utilize him?
He's a one-year Band-Aid, but more importantly, he's your insurance policy for Kenny Vaccaro. Look at the depth chart behind both Bird and Vaccaro.
Oh, yes.
Their experience in the NFL is null and void. There's none. So, Eric, where do you go here? And if I'm the coach here, I understand there are certain situations where, yeah, I want a young player. I want that athletic guy. But also, I got to have a guy that knows what he's doing. And now I'm going with all these young kids at safety. What's the chances of Jarvis Bird playing 16 games on this team? Slim and none.
No doubt.
So what happens if something happens to Vaccaro? Now you've got yourself in a real pickle here. So that's why I think Roman comes in, one year insurance policy. You can use him on some sets close to the line of scrimmage, almost playing like another linebacker. I'm sure they'll come up with the sub packages. What I'm interested in, from 2009 to 2011, he had more sacks by a safety than any other safety in the NFL under Greg Williams. Do you utilize that? Because you know what? I got to find a pass rush somewhere, Eric. Somewhere, somehow, I've got to be able to find a way to put pressure on the quarterback. Will you use Roman in that way? People say, well, look what happened in Carolina. Well, if I'm Carolina, I don't need him rushing the quarterback. I got 7 other guys up front, or 4 other guys up front that can put pressure.
Yes.
I do think you're going to see him in a lot of these sub packages, close to the line of scrimmage, help out in run support, also as a blitzer.
You mentioned Eric Harris a little bit earlier, Canadian football refugee who is now with the Saints. A guy that played linebacker in Canada, is now a safety with New Orleans. Your thoughts on him as a guy, first of all, that can stick on this team. Second of all, what you think his role will be?
I think he's a little bit of a hybrid player, that he could play both free and strong. I want him in my nickel packages because he can cover. One thing I know, if you play in the Canadian Football League, man, it's wide open. It's the Wild Wild West of throwing. So he understands that part of the game very well. One of the things you could see in minicamp was his ability to find the ball quickly in flight. I can't teach you that, Eric. Either you know it or you don't.
Instincts.
He knows it. He's very instinctive to the football. He's lost some weight. He looks like a thinner player than what I saw when he was out in Canada. So I think he'll be a nice addition to this football team, also help him out on special teams. Man, listen, you hit gold with Delvin Breaux. You may have come up with another real good football player here in Eric Harris. Now, he's not going to compete for a starting job.
Yes.
But in the NFL, there's a lot of room for role players, and I think that's what Eric's going to bring to the table. But what I was really impressed with, the depth at wide receiver on offense.
Really, and that goes to the guys that are undrafted free agents, to maybe some holdovers from last year.
No
Talk
question.
a bit about it.
First things first, the MVP of the training camp period, Michael Thomas. Second round.
Says a lot.
Says a lot, but it's true. I mean, you take Drew Brees out the bunch, and listen, we went to one practice, the ball never touched the ground. 16 passes, never anything fell. But Mike Thomas, what I see in him as a rookie receiver, his ability to get into and out of his cutting and break, so smooth in his hands. And I listen to the sound. When you hear a receiver catch the ball and you don't hear it, you know he knows that ball's right there. And you listen to when Kyle Prater or Brandon Coleman catches the ball, it's smack. It's the big thump. It's close to the chest, and they're fighting it. And occasionally they make a big play. With Mike Thomas, he looked like a pro. And again, Drew Brees, how many times have you heard him praise a rookie receiver?
Rarely.
He went out of his way to say, man, Mike Thomas and I, we work after practice. That was a play in training camp that he gave him a look. I wanted you to be in this spot. He ran to the spot, hit it. I think Mike Thomas, red zone, short area of the field, is going to have a nice impact in year one. And you can see the rapport between the two guys. Also the maturity of Mike Thomas, who was redshirted at Ohio State because he didn't pick up the system quick enough. And I think that maturity level, you see it in Mike today. Also impressed with R.J. Harris, who last year, he flashed it. Good route runner, quick, catch the football well. And I think the sleeper of a guy that you can put maybe on developmental, Jared Dangerfield from Western Kentucky. Tall drink of water guy, JUCO prospect, came in, played in the system at Western Kentucky where they threw the football all over the field. Good route runner. And again, what I noticed, smooth. Out of the cuts and the breaks, and when it hits his hands, no sound, no thud. And so you look at that, and you've also got Brandon Cooks and Willie Snead, and so you've got some pieces there. And I put this out a couple weeks back about Kobe Fleener. And if you're a fantasy football player, he's a guy that I bet catches 75 or more catches this year, and 8 or more touchdowns in this offense. He's tailor-made for it.
Right. Mixed reviews on Garrett Grayson. Your thoughts?
Man, I hear this all the time about, it's time to get rid of Drew Brees. Well, my thing is, who are you going to replace him with? If you think Garrett Grayson is here to replace him, what do you want to do? Have the first pick in the draft next year? Garrett Grayson, the one thing I see with him, he doesn't push the envelope, Eric. As a passer, a lot of it is dump off, check down, throw it short underneath. He's still fighting it mentally, the NFL game. And when you think about, and I had this conversation with Bobby just yesterday about it, that I look what he did with A.J. McCarron at Alabama. In that 2011 year where, man, he really didn't play well in the regular season against LSU. And all of a sudden, BCS championship game, A.J. McCarron was pretty good. And then he blossomed the next year. Jim McElwain coached Garrett Grayson at Colorado State. And you see his influence on what he was able to do at the collegiate level. I would say you're absolutely right about the mixed reviews. Some passes he makes look nice, and in others, you wonder a little bit. I think at this stage, if something would happen to Drew Brees, no question, Luke McCown's the guy. I mean, there's no even debate on that.
Before we shift gears and talk about your memories and 50 years of Saints history, It's hard to judge interior defensive linemen, interior offensive linemen during mini camp and OTAs, but everybody that I talk to asks me all the time, Andres Pete, is he going to work out at the guard position? From what you've been able to see so far, and again, it's very difficult without any hitting, what are your thoughts?
He's thinner, looks in better shape. I still believe he's cut for the tackle position. But you know what? He's not a better player right now than Zach Strief. So you got to find a spot for him. And it's inside at that guard position. Again, you really don't know about offensive linemen. And Eric, I think it's the one thing when I look over the last 5 years and I see what the new CBA did, it took away really good offensive line play in this league. Some of the worst offensive line play I've seen in the NFL has been the last couple of years. No continuity. You don't have a lot of hitting. So I'm interested to see offensively how well this team can gel up front along that offensive line. But if you're asking me, is he a better player right now than Zach Strief? I'll say no.
Do you think that they are settled at this guard position right now in terms of maybe not going out and getting a veteran that's going to come in here and maybe fight for that left guard spot?
I would be shocked if this team did not go out and get a veteran guard somewhere. If it's via a trade or ringing that doorbell of Jari Evans. You know, if it's Leary out in Dallas who wants out, one thing with Leary, I would have some reservations about. He's had some knee issues, so I want to know about him physically. But I'd be shocked if they enter the season with the guards that they have on the roster today.
Yes. We're going to shift gears, and we're going to shift gears and talk a bit about the 50 years of Saints history with Mike Detillier, some of his memories of the New Orleans Saints, some great stories of Buddy D. All that coming up next year on Inside New Orleans Sports. Don't forget, there's a rebroadcast of this program each and every Friday night at 10 o'clock right here on WLAE and also statewide on Pelican Sports Television. That's 9 o'clock every Friday night. We'll be right back.
Sports with Eric Asher is underwritten by.
Located on Lake Pontchartrain, Brisbee's Lakefront Restaurant and Bar offers traditional West End favorites, a scenic view, oysters, and numerous tasty options. More information is available at 504-304-4125 or brisbeesrestaurant.com. Mr. Ed's Oyster Bar and Fish House has been shucking here since 1979. Located at 3117 21st Street in Metairie, Mr. Ed's Oyster Bar and Fish House offers raw, fried, and grilled oysters as well as a range of Cajun and Creole dishes. Enjoy a dozen with a smile. You're watching WLAE, New Orleans Public Television. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter.
Inside New Orleans Sports. Mike Detillier of WWL Radio is our guest tonight. We're going to do something a little bit different as we've kind of done throughout our shows and we'll continue to do as we talk to a lot of the media members that join us on this panel weekly, kind of get their take of their memories, their thoughts on 50 years of Saints football. Now, some of these guys are pups, and they don't remember much about the old days. Some of them just got to New Orleans, and they only know what they know now. Mike and I have been around since the inception.
Since the start.
Yeah, so we both have seen a lot of Saints football.
Seen some bad football.
Some
Eric.
really bad football, Mike.
God.
But Mike, some of your first memories for the audience out there that, you know, as a kid, both you and I are the same age. You know, as a kid growing up, you know, November 1st, 1966 is when they awarded the team. And, of course, shortly after that next season is when Saints football started. Just throw some memories out there for us. And we're going to kind of go through this last part of the show, just talking about your memories, my memories, and some great stories that you've got from obviously in the broadcast booth with Buddy D as well.
You know, one of the things is the backdrop of how this team got the franchise. It was a political deal. Basically, Lyndon Johnson, Russell Long, Allen Ellen. There was a political deal to get that franchise here in New Orleans. Dave Dixon, God bless him, he did unbelievable work to get it here. My first memories of it were certainly that the Saints got Jimmy Taylor. You know, as a kid, you watch Green Bay Packers football,
Yes.
Jimmy Taylor. But you're 6, 7 years old, man. You don't realize, Jimmy Taylor's at that point in his career, it's all over
Yes.
with for him. But that's a memory for me that I'll never forget. That my dad had season tickets, but he had 2. So, I have an older brother who's 5 years older. So guess who went to the first game? It wasn't the young pup.
Right.
My brother went. That listening to it, and they did it a little bit different, the introduction, everybody individually, and they saved Jimmy for last. And that stadium shook for 1 minute. I mean, you could not hear anything for Taylor's introduction.
Yes.
And then Gilliam takes off 94 yards. You couldn't have written a better script. My buddy used to always tell me, Mike, from that moment forward until Jim Mora got here, everything was downhill.
Yeah.
And you think about it, it really kind of set the tone. The thing I do remember a lot about then, 6 preseason games, the Saints were 5-1.
I was going to say 5-1 that first year, right?
5-1. You lost the first preseason game to the Rams out on the coast, and then you swept it. And you said, man, you're a kid, and you hear other people talk, man, this might be a pretty good team as an expansion team. You find out real quick that really wasn't the case at all. But some of the memories of that certainly is Gilliam's run. And you watched Jimmy and you said, wow, the Packers made him look good. No, at that point in his career, he had taken a lot of shots. And I was showing you this, that this is the Sports Illustrated year 1 with Gary Quazzo, who the Saints gave up the first pick in the draft, which ended up being Bubba Smith.
Yes.
And a guy that ended up being a pretty good player and a coach, Bill Curry. The Saints got in the expansion draft. But Taylor and Quazzo hits the cover, 1967, and you said, wow, that, things are really great. The Diliberta story to go along with Quazzo is that Buddy had just left the Times-Picayune to go do television.
Yes.
At that time, ABC wasn't even a full-time channel.
Right.
Now, believe that. It's hard to believe, but it's true.
Today, yes.
So he's on, and they tell him, listen, you got to have a half-an-hour show. Well, at that time, Tom Fears, who was the head coach, had committed to Channel 4. He did the show with Hap. Jimmy Taylor, Paul Horning, they were also with CBS at that moment. So Buddy's like, I see all these shows. They got Don Meredith and Joe Namath and Bart Starr. They all have their own shows. Quarterback. Man, look what the Saints gave up for Quazzo. Even though he was a backup quarterback in Baltimore behind Unitas, I'll have the Gary Quazzo show. So they go out and get Gary, and, first game of the season, guess what? Billy Kilmer's the starting quarterback, and Diliberto's got to do the show with the backup quarterback for a half an hour. And Billy never let him forget it. And they would be in the locker room, and Billy told me the story close to Buddy, so I know it's accurate. He would stay in the locker room and pass the brush through his hair and everything. Buddy, I'll be with you in just a second. But if you want to get that inside information, go talk to Gary. And he would needle him and needle him and needle him about it the entire time. And it was unbelievable that you gave up the first pick in the draft and a really good young center in Bill Curry and a third-round pick for a guy that ended up being a backup quarterback. The salvation was the next year, Jim Finks, who was in Minnesota, gives the Saints 2 first-round picks for Quazzo.
Right.
So the other part of the story is Super Bowl IV. Quazzo's a backup again to Joe Cap.
Yes.
So you would figure, it was just after Namath and the Jets, and everybody thought maybe that, it was a one-time unbelievable upset. 8-point favorite, the Vikings over Kansas City. They fly into New Orleans. Buddy's got the crew out there ready to interview people, and he says, man, I see Gary, so I'll bring him over. I'd done a year with him, and he said, man, he was as square as could be. Good guy, but, nothing out of the ordinary that he would do. So he said, we doing the interview and everything else, and he said all the right things, and he said, as soon as the light goes off, he says, Gary, what do you think about the game? He said, and the Vikings are an 8-point favorite. And he said, 8-point favorite over them? And he said, the camera's not rolling, huh? He said, no. He said, buddy, they every bit as good as us. Ding, ding, But Buddy, he was off to place that bet. So he had a couple $1,000s on the Chiefs. And like he said, it was a no-sweat bet.
Right.
The Chiefs ended up winning the game outright. He didn't even need the 8 points. So he said, you know what? For all the flack I took for Gary Quazzo's show,
Right.
he made it up for me.
Yes, he
said, I
did.
paid off my first house with the money that he bet on the.
Right, we're talking 1970 now for that Super Bowl, right?
That's correct.
So that's, I mean, you're talking big money back then.
Yeah, and so, but he said, man, you know, I was looking for an inside deal, but he said, I would have never thought the tip would have come from Gary.
Quazzo, right.
But he said, you know, Gary, he said he was always one of these guys that watched a lot of film, and he saw, and he was right. He said, you know what? He said, thinking about it now, you know, he didn't try to BS me on anything. He knew it was correct. But I just think about those early years, all the mistakes. And John Meekum getting this franchise, who was a 26-year-old guy. His dad was one of the richest men in the world. And he wanted to say, I did it on my own.
Yes.
And the difference between Senior and Junior was, Senior surrounded himself with really smart people,
Right.
financially, could give him the right advice in the all-field business, everything else. And Junior would take advice from anybody. It could be a bartender. It could be a sports columnist. He was taking advice from other minority owners or owners of NFL teams.
Right.
So you think they're going to steer
They're
you
going to
right?
help you, right? Exactly.
I mean, that's not going to happen. So I think a lot of the Quazzo situation was steered by his friendship with a minority owner of the Cowboys who said, you know, Gary Quazzo was pretty good. I saw him in a couple games with the Colts. So, you know, they rented it out. The one thing he did, and Buddy was in his corner on this, he pushed the Roselle rule on the fact of not signing free agents. Because remember, when the Saints got him,
Yes.
he was technically a free agent. The Saints signed him and said, listen, you got to compensate the Packers. They did. The next year, Meekum pushed it and said, you know what? We're signing Dave Parks, who was also a free
Right.
agent. And the commissioner said, oh, no. You did this once. I told you can't do it again. So he stripped the team of 2 first-round picks. But he would listen to anybody and everybody. After the 68 season, it was not a secret that Vince Lombardi, who had won Super Bowls 1 and 2, then resigned to become the GM of the Packers, wanted back in. So through Jimmy Taylor, John Meekum set up a deal that he wanted to talk to Vince to come back and coach the Saints. Now, Vince already had in his pocket the deal with the Redskins, with Edward Bennett Williams, and he also had equity in the team. They gave him a part of the team. So it never went down with that, with Lombardi, but they did have the conversation. This was year 2. So already, you can see the termites are already going after Fears' foundation, that the second year you're already looking at a coaching change here. He jumps from Lombardi, takes a plane to Austin, Texas, and talks to Darryl Royal.
Another big name.
And this time in the college ranks.
Yes.
And Darryl was, man, I'm not leaving the college ranks to go coach an NFL team, because, you know, Darryl was used to coaching by fear.
Right.
And in the NFL, even at that point, there's still that cut, and could you do it? But there was a lot of rumors, certainly, at that point that teams were looking toward the college ranks. The Dolphins went after Bear Bryant, and Bear said no. And he said, thinking about it now, man, I could have had Zonka and Kick and Warfield. You know, I could have had all those guys, and not just for 4 years. He turned down that spot. A year later, Joe Paterno turns down the Patriots. And only one took it, Tommy Prothero.
Right.
He leaves UCLA to go to the Rams. But it goes to show, Eric, just the futility of it all, of that you had a mercurial young owner basically taking advice from anybody and anyone, and that's why you had such a slosh for so many years in this franchise.
Mike Detillier is with us from WWL Radio. We're looking back at 50 years of Saints football, and you mentioned surrounding himself with again anybody and everybody, and it's well known for anybody that's been a long-time Saints fan that knows the history of this team. Vic Schwank, Dick Gordon, the astronaut. I mean, you're right on target with that, Mike. I mean, that was one of the things that really kind of set this franchise back when he didn't have football guys that were in charge of the football team going forward. And a lot of times he went and got guys that we're in other walks of life. You know, we hear it all the time. I remember in my mind's eye right now, Buddy D talking about the astronaut. You know?
Well, the crazy thing about that, and that's what got him kicked off the plane for life. At that time, Grid Week had that weekly magazine.
Grid Week.
And, you know, they had all the local guys here would write on there.
It was Wayne Mack, Champ Clark, Buddy D, I mean, Steve Stonebreaker.
All those guys wrote there. And Dick Gordon went to a Saints luncheon and said, we 3 players away from the Super Bowl. And I can remember Buddy writing that as a splash headline on Grid Week. Saints 3 players away. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. 3 players away. And that got him basically kicked off the plane for life. That was it. Because Meekum had enough of him. But that was really what broke the camel's back on that deal.
He wore it as a badge of honor, though, didn't he?
Did he? I mean, you know, he was the first one to call him out.
Yes.
And he told me, you know what, I was in his corner for 2 years. But he said, you know, the guy that really shed the light on him was actually Dave Dixon. Because Dave was involved very early in the ownership part of this team. And he said, you know, buddy, he never takes advice well if we try to tell him something. But he said, you know, the other thing about him is, and he said, you know, and I think about it even in today's world. He said, you know, if I'd call him for something, he would never return my phone call. It would be 2 days, 3 days, 4 days later. And you think about today's world, where you have a cell phone and everything else.
Instant communication.
Instant. And how many times you communicate with somebody and it's 8, 10, 12 hours or the next day or 2 days later? So you know what? It's irrelevant.
Right.
So he was the one who tipped Buddy off about, hey, listen, kind of keep your eye on this. I think Meekum, I made a bad mistake pushing him for ownership. And Buddy ran with that. And did he run with it? I mean, he was, you know, he was like Adrian Peterson.
Yeah.
Now, Pete Finney did it in a different manner. Pete was like a surgeon. He cut him up surgically. Buddy was like a sledgehammer, and he kept pounding you and pounding you and pounding you, and you couldn't get out of the way at that point. And Billy Kilmer had told me that, you know, when they brought Archie in, he said, I knew that was kind of the end of the trail for me. I was gone. But he said, you know, basically he had had a couple run-ins with Meekum, and Meekum's deal was don't trade him, bury him. So he said, they dealt me to the Redskins.
Yeah.
And he said, you know what? Sonny was there. Sonny Jurgensen, who was a great quarterback, a Hall of Fame quarterback.
Absolutely.
And he says, you know, my first meeting with George Allen, they bring me in, and he says, Billy, how much you made with the Saints? And he said, you know, I was making about $68,000, $70,000 with the Saints. And I said, what, you talking about what, you know, Billy, he was talking about incentives and all this. He said, I'm talking about, he said, man, I have a contract here in my drawer. He said, I think you're a $100,000 quarterback. Billy said, my first impression was, man, you better give me that paper. Let me sign it right now. You give it to me. Give it to me right now. But what goes to show you, I think there was a lot of different personalities, but the biggest personality early on was Doug Atkins.
Yes.
Oh.
Talk about some of those great stories.
Doug did, you know, and I had heard it and, you know, watched all the things and read it. But we did a show with Doug. And Buddy took a job, and he was doing some commentary on a country western station. He said, you know, they were paying me pretty good money, so I decided to do it. So he said, you know, every couple of times a week I do commentary. And he said, my commentary in '69 was, it's time to sit some of the older guys down and play the young kids. And he said, you know, I didn't get anybody say anything about it. And he said, finally, we going on the plane, we leaving. And he said, one of the Saints guys says, hey, listen, Big Doug is mad at you. He said, for what? He said, he heard you on the country western station. But it was like, oh, man, I don't want to get him upset. So he said, we sit down, and he said, we take off. And he said, we had not been in the air 2 minutes. Doug sat in first class, and he got up, and he's screaming at the top of his lungs that he said, you no good, blankety blank, and all this and that. He goes after Diliberto and basically puts his hand that he was going to pick him up, and his deal was, I'm going to open that door, and I'm going to throw you out this plane. But he said, you know, if somebody else would have told me that, I really wouldn't have paid too much attention to it. But he said, you know, Doug was crazy enough, he would have done it. And he said, you know who basically cooled everybody off? He said, I sat right next to Wayne Mack. And he said, you know, Wayne heard the ruckus, and he saw Doug reach for me. And he said, finally, Wayne put his arm out like that, and he said, buddy, if I was you, I wouldn't take that from Doug. And Doug said, all I could do was bite down on my lip not to bust out laughing. He said, because it was so hilarious. Right. And he said, all I did was, he said, I let him go and I walked back up front. But he said, I didn't want to show him I was laughing. Saints ended up winning that game. And they used to give him a 6-pack of beer when they'd get on the plane. So Buddy's thing is, I saw Doug get on the plane before me. He said, I went and I gave him my 6-pack of beer. And he said, we became really good friends after that. But he said, Buddy, what you saying? Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But we got guys young on this team that can't play. And Doug's deal was, at 38 years old, I'm a better player today than I was when I was 23. Now, that's saying something.
That is saying something.
But you think about this, Eric. It ended so great for Doug. Last game, the last play, he sacks Dick Shiner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. The last play he ever steps on a football field, he gets a quarterback sack. He was an unbelievable player. Man, I read all this stuff about the great pass rushers the Saints have had, certainly with Ricky and Pat Swilling and Wayne Moore. You can kind of go down the list. Man, Doug Atkins has got to be on that list.
Gotcha.
He did that at 36, 37, 38 years old in a 3-year run that was unbelievable. When you think about the NFL, how many guys that age could still play at that level?
Right.
He was one of the most feared guys. The other training camp story, and this comes from Diliberto, and yet I've heard it enough times. Doug never had a roommate. He slept in quarters by himself with he had a dog. He used to bring the dog with him. And the dog drank as much as Doug did. And so that was really saying something. Doug would go to the bar, and he told me the story that he wanted to stop drinking beer because he said it picked his weight up, so he started drinking martinis. But he said they never told him how much it would get him drunk.
Right.
So he said, one night I'm drinking martinis in there, and the 2 guys above him were playing Motown music and playing it loud. And Doug had a bat, and he hit the top of the ceiling, and he hollered at him, hey, y'all better turn down that music. And he said, the comment I heard back, now again, this is Doug saying it, the comment I heard back was, hey, old man, it's time for you to go to sleep. So Doug took out a pistol and shot 5 holes in that ceiling. And next thing you know, the 2 guys are jumping out of the window to get out of there. He had cleared the deal. And our deal was, well, he said, no, the coaches never told me nothing. They did tell the 2 guys that roomed above me, you better not be playing that music loud at night because you upset Doug, and so different times, different world, but Doug was the real character of that team at that time. That was nobody that could do it like he could.
Yes.
Rarely practiced. Mike Ditka told the story that when he was in Chicago, they had a field that they would plant, and Doug would get on the tractor and ride the tractor during practice sessions. He never practiced.
Right.
He said, the one thing about him was, he used to tell him, listen, do not cut him low, because if you do, he's going to be mad at the guy that cut him and be mad at the other 4 offensive linemen. So he said, that was a creed, so to speak, in the NFL. Do not go low on Doug, because he's going to take it out on everybody. Now, you think about that's a lot of fear.
Oh, yes.
But, the NFL doesn't want to talk about those days when there was some retaliation across the board. But really, there was so much bad news until 71 when Archie came in.
That's right. And, of course, because the excitement, they always had this great excitement for Saints football, but when Archie came in, there was a huge excitement. I can remember being in grammar school and wishing and hoping that the Saints would get Archie Manning. And then, of course, they got Archie Manning. And from then on, I mean, I guess if you could compare it, I could compare it to maybe '87 when the Saints were going to the playoffs, that type of euphoria that happened back then when Manning was drafted by the Saints.
Yeah, because, he was one of those type of guys that, and this is the 72 press guide with Archie on it. This is year 2 of Archie.
Yes.
They didn't put him on in year 1, but he got on in year 2. But Archie always teases me about this because I tell him, growing up for me, athletically, idols, man, Muhammad Ali, Pete Maravich, Archie Manning. He said, man, Mike, with all that white hair you got on your head, you got to stop saying that. You're making me look old doing this. But, you saw Archie, and I think for people in the South, and especially in Louisiana, Archie beat LSU as a sophomore and a junior and cost them a shot at a national championship. My buddy Ronnie Estee, he still now got over that.
Former Tiger.
Former Tiger, All-American, everything else. They were 9-1, did not go to a bowl. Now, you think about that. I mean, that's a story in itself that you didn't even go. You went to no bowl because Notre Dame decides that year, for the first time in 43 years, we're going to go bowling. We're going to go to the Cotton Bowl and play Texas. So Archie cost you a couple shots at a national championship. Archie was a big-time player. And
some LSU fans have never forgiven him, right? Especially the old timers.
Yeah, I would say that's probably correct. That, you know, that and that he didn't send one of the boys to LSU. No, he could have made up a little bit.
In modern times, for sure.
In modern times,
no doubt.
for sure. But, you know, he was one of those tilt-the-field type athletes. And just the other day we were talking, we had an event at Thibodeau Regional Medical Center. We have a crawfish bowl every year. And he was like, Mike, let me tell you what happened. When I got picked by the Saints, they told me, listen, you're going to be one of the first 3 picks. Come sit in the coach's office. And he said, you know, the phone rang pretty quickly. And it was, hey, this is John Meekum, the owner of the Saints. We just want to tell you, glad to have you here in New Orleans. We've just selected you with the first pick, you know, our first pick, second pick overall in the draft. He said, I talked to the head coach. And he said, I put the phone down and I went back to class.
Really?
He said there was nothing like what
it
you
is
see
today. Oh my gosh!
But he said, you know, basically that was it. He said, you know, Johnny Vaught was coming here. You're going to get the phone call. And Plunkett went first. He went second. Pastorini went third. And he said that was basically the end of the day. And he said, you know, in a couple of days I went to New Orleans, him and Olivia, and he said, just think about what it is today.
Yes.
The circus that goes around draft time today is unbelievable. But he said that's how my draft day started and ended.
You know, Mike, interesting you bring up Archie Manning. I remember 3 things that really stick out. Obviously, him being drafted was one we just talked about, but him getting hurt, sliding into the dugout, I think it was against the Kansas City Chiefs in preseason. They didn't know, they had 6 preseason games back then, and they didn't know if he was going to be ready for the regular season. Beating the Los Angeles Rams on the last play of the game, and then
first game of
the year, right? Okay, and then the Dallas Cowboys, beating the Dallas Cowboys as well.
We ended up winning the
Super Bowl that
year. And Roger Staubach, we've had him on a few times, Roger said that game won him the starting spot. Because remember, they were alternating quarterbacks.
That's right,
him and Craig Martin. And so he said that game that the Saints beat him basically gave the baton to Roger. And I mean, you think about that. But one of the funny Archie stories was that when JD was there and they played a preseason game against the Buffalo Bills, and he said, you know, the regulars played about a half back then. And he said, you know, Buffalo Bills, and man, all the stuff now today, O.J. Simpson. Every time you turn on TV today, it's O.J. And he said, J.D. Roberts turned and told, I don't know who that number 32 is, but he's pretty good. He said, you know, I still think about that today.
Yeah.
He realized that it was O.J. Simpson out there. You know, and O.J. come out as maybe the most heralded college athlete of all time. You're talking about football-wise. But when they picked Archie, one of the stories Archie tells us that the draft was in late January. So he plays in the Hula Bowl out in Hawaii. And he said, you know, back then you tried to kind of figure out who was really good players. And he said, man, they had Dan Dierdorf on the team. He said, man, Dan was unbelievable. He's a Michigan guy. He said, you know, you understand that they didn't throw the ball a lot, but he said, you know, he was really good. So he says, you know, kind of looking at who the Saints picked, and they picked Sam Holden from Grambling ahead of Dan Dierdorf. And he said, you know, he said, I think it was either Buddy or Hap asked me, you know, what do you think about Sam Holden? He said, well, he must be pretty good. They picked him ahead of Dan Dierdorf. Sam Holden lasted 1 year in the NFL, and Dierdorf's in the NFL Hall of Fame.
Yes.
Because of it. It goes to show all the misses they did on draft day. In '68, Dave Simakowski, West Texas State, white kid who could run, great speed, comes to camp. He played with a crew cut. Comes to camp, his hair's down to his shoulders. He's got a beard, everything else, and he could run, but he couldn't catch.
Sounds like Larry Burton.
Well, and then that brings to the other story, because in essence, why they got Larry was in the same year the Saints picked Rick Middleton, who wasn't even the best linebacker on his own team.
No, he wasn't.
Randy Gradishaw was.
Yes.
They passed on Lynn Swann. And, you know, Archie's deal was, man, Lynn Swann, watching him, he's a terrific player. And so he said, I had to talk with Mika, man, you know, Lynn Swann, you know, he's a terrific football player. So he said, we passed on him to pick Middleton. But then the next year, to find that receiver, they picked Burton. So he said it was basically one domino hitting the next, that you missed on Swan, so you were going to go after the track guy who had been in the Olympic trials, everything else, and he couldn't play. He could run, but he couldn't catch.
You know, one of the high points back then, 1973, you mentioned O.J. Simpson. He goes for over 2,000 yards, an NFL record.
Unbelievable.
If you remember Tulane Stadium, taking on the Buffalo Bills.
They slammed him.
They did. 73 yards is what O.J. Simpson had, you know, against the New Orleans Saints defense, which was not a great defense, because I remember, I think that was the same year as they opened up the season, 62-0 against the Atlanta Falcons when they got drubbed.
I think it was a 63-7. I think they scored one touchdown, but that was it. But it was in that range.
Right.
The crazy thing is, ABC now is pushing all these Monday night broadcasts now. I mean, it was a stroke of luck for them to get it, because it really put ABC on the map.
Yes, it did.
To have Monday night football. So Buddy goes in the locker room, and the affiliates would always, the game before, have you talk to the star player. And the Bills were playing the next Monday night game. So Buddy goes up to OJ and says, hey, you know, I would need an interview. And he's, man, Buddy, I gotta go. I gotta catch the plane. But he said, if you want to do the interview, he said, I'll have a limo. He said, so Buddy did the interview with OJ from the back of the limousine. OJ, the rest of the team went in the bus. OJ went in the limo and catch the plane. So that's how he got the interview with OJ, because the Bills were playing on Monday Night Football. The following Monday night, the Saints ended up upsetting the Bills that day in Tulane Stadium, but also holding OJ. And that was huge, because of what he tilted the field as a player. He was an unbelievable football player off the field, and you finding out more and more and more today. That's just shocking. Yeah. With him, but he was a great player.
No doubt. Let's fast forward to Hank Strams being brought in by the New Orleans Saints. Talk a little bit about that, and of course the offense that he ultimately built.
Yeah. Well, one of the guys that was a big part of bringing Hank in is the guy that was on the press guide for year 2.
Yes.
Al Hurt.
Who the halftime shows were incredible.
And Al was a minority owner of the Saints at that time. When the Chiefs won Super Bowl IV, Al approached Hank about, come coach the Saints. And Hank was, no, I'm not leaving. He said, you know, if I would leave, I would go coach the Bears. But he knew George Halas wasn't going to pay him. You know, what he was making with Lamar Hunt was one of the richest men in the world at that point. Hank gets fired, sits out a year, does TV, has a couple teams after him. He comes back, and he's got Archie. And he told me that was the reason he came, because he would have Archie. And then he ends up Muncie, Galbraith. And Archie gets hurt, you know, and so it really never clicked into that sport. But you just think about Hank's offense was innovative, no question about it. Hank wasn't a great draft choice guy either. I mean, other than Muncie and Galbraith, he kind of whiffed on a lot of those picks. If it was Joe Campbell and Mike Foltz and Robert Watts, whiff across the board. But he had an offense that was set up for when he got fired. Dick Nolan came in, and they won, and they pushed the limit. They pushed the limit on there. And you think about those Atlanta games.
The flex defense.
The flex defense. But if you think about, you know, Big Ben and Big Ben 2, those 2 games basically cost that football team from hitting the playoffs. And, you know, Dick could never hold it together, and then the drug issues hit in 80.
Bum Phillips comes in. They get very, very close to the playoffs. He really kind of set the table for Jim Moore with a lot of his drafts.
He sure did. Bum was a great talent evaluator, and this is the 82. Well, it's a drawing, but he was the guy.
Yes.
George Rogers. That was the guy that Bum thought would be his version of Earl Campbell. And so Bum did a great job of collecting talent. But Wade told me this, and he said, Dad will always say this, that Mike Lansford kick in 83 that knocked him out of the playoffs basically tore the heart of Bum as a coach. And he said he was never the same as a coach after that, because that would have gotten the Saints into the playoffs for the first time ever. There was some crazy things that happened in that game. Russell Erxleben makes a half-hearted effort on a punt return to try to make a tackle. But Bum gives up a shot late with Martin Anderson on a long field goal. I think it was 52 or 53 yards to punt. And he gave the Rams that opportunity in Langsford. Listen, Eric, I've been disappointed before in Saints games. But if you're a Saints fan and you think about that moment, you were so close. And you could almost taste it that you had it. You had it in the bag. And then Lansford hit that thing through, and it just didn't tear Bum's heart out. I think for a lot of Saints fans, it tore their hearts out too.
81 draft leads to, again, a lot of great players on this team, which leads to 86, Jim Finks, Jim Moore coming in, and that 87 draft. And, Mike, that USL supplemental draft, talk a little bit about the combination of Bum's cupboard not being bare, and then, of course, Moore coming in with that knowledge of the USFL, and Jim Finks kind of putting it all together.
Yeah, getting Sam Mills, that was huge because, you know, Sam was – they listed him at 5'9", you know.
Field mouse.
There's no way he was 5'9".
Right.
But, you know, you got Antonio Gibson that would come in. Chuck Comiskey came in. Bobby J. I didn't bring his, so, Bobby, if you're watching, sorry about that. But I do have his hung on the wall, too. But, you know.
Vaughn Johnson
coming in. Mel Gray came in. And along with, you got Dombrowski, Reuben Mays, Dalton Hilliard, Pat Swilling. And that kind of sealed it. And, you know, Jim was a great coach, but Finks, I think really he had his eye for talent. He understood at that point. He'd have been terrible in the free agency world because, you know, he didn't go for that sort of thing. And then him and Bobby really got into it pretty good with that. The Bobby story is that Bobby was going to sign in '85 with Seattle. He's in Seattle with the Nordstrom team, who, at that time, who owns the Nordstrom stores all over. He was going to sign in Seattle. His dad gets a phone call from Leonard Chabert, from Edwin Edwards. And he says, listen, I'm trying to get in touch with Bobby Hebert. So Leonard says, well, I can get in touch with Bobby Sr. So Bobby Sr. calls Bobby J. and says, listen, the governor's trying to get in touch with you. Give me a number he can call you. And Bobby said, within minutes. You know, he said, this is your governor, Bob. He said, listen, Tom Benson's buying the Saints, and we want you on this team. Have you signed a contract? He said, no, Governor, I haven't, but I've agreed to terms. He said, so you haven't signed? He said, no, I haven't. He said, good. Stay where you at. We'll have a private plane, and we'll bring you to San Antonio. Bobby had agreed to a deal that would have paid him about $800,000 a year, which was a lot of money back then.
No doubt.
At that point, he goes in, and, you know, he's sweating it out because he said, man, here, I left a deal of $800 grand. I don't know what's going to happen in San Antonio. And his attorney, Hugh Campbell, comes out and says, Bobby, they're going to pay you $1.25 million a year.
Yeah.
And he said, but, Mike, it would have never happened had it not been for Edwin Edwards. Edwin stepped in and said, you know what? Forget it. And I think about that a year ago, where a guy that was falsely accused of something in La'el Collins, a Louisiana guy, Baton Rouge kid, great player at LSU. And we have an absentee governor who's trying to be president of the United States.
Bobby Jindal.
Instead of taking care of business in Louisiana. I know one thing. If Edwin Edwards was governor then, all planes leaving the state of Louisiana would have been shut down. Jerry Jones would have never gotten the plane in or out at that point in time. But it does go to show you, I think, and Edwin was a big part of keeping the Saints here. Whatever you want to think about his politics.
No doubt. And they were going to Jacksonville.
They were going to Jacksonville. Meekum was going to Jacksonville. And he told me the story that he basically told John, if you move this team to Jacksonville, you will never, ever do 1 cent of business in this state.
And they were in the all business.
They were in the all business. And so he said, well, find me an owner. And he said that's when he got in touch with Tom Benson. So, you know, whatever you want to think about Edwards' politics, he kept this franchise. He saved this football team. He saved it, and then Tom Benson came up with the money at that time to buy it.
Let's fast forward just about 4 minutes left in the show and talk about your memories of the Saints winning the Super Bowl. Sean Payton comes in. They go to the NFC Championship. There's a little bit of a lull, and then 2009, maybe the greatest year in Saints history.
Best memory I've ever had covering a game was NFC Championship game, seeing Garrett Hartley kick that field goal. the emotion in that press box.
Yes.
That day. Marco came get me doing the Spanish radio network, and he says, "Come say something." Okay, what do you want me to say? No, just talk in English. I ended up doing my little thing, and Bobby's standing not far from me, and I said, "Come, I said, you need to." And he said, "What radio station is this?" I said, "This is a Spanish radio station." He said, "Well, listen, most people don't think I know how to speak English." I said, "Okay, we're not going to debate that. Just say." About a minute later, I see he's on his knees, and he is crying like a baby.
Yes.
The emotions of that day. Eric, I could have gotten 50 rides from the Dome to where I parked at.
Yes.
People were so excited about that. The Super Bowl, to me, and watching Tracy was, you knew you had won it, but it was getting there. And you think about all your friends and relatives that didn't have that moment.
Yes, yes.
I think about my dad who didn't have that moment.
Yes.
To see that. And that, to me, that NFC Championship game, hardly hitting it. But really, Sean changed the world for the Saints.
He did.
Sean Payton changed the world when he came in 2006, what he did for this franchise as a coach, as a guy that pumped new life on this team, but he connected with Drew Brees.
He did.
And that turned this football team completely around, however you want to cut it. And the other part, too, is it's not something that maybe is politically correct, but it was the greatest one-year run of any acquisition the Saints ever made.
True.
Darren Sharper.
No doubt.
Greatest one-year hit with Sharper, and what he did for that football team, he turned that defense into being very opportunistic guys. But Sean changed the world. As good as Finks and Mora were, Sean brought you to the highest level. And not once, twice, he got you to the NFC Championship game. I think his best coaching job was 06, with that team getting one step away from going to the Super Bowl.
No doubt. Mike, of all the memories, got about a minute and a half left, greatest memory outside of the Super Bowl for you?
Again, I go back to Hartley's NFC Championship game. I do remember partially hearing Tom Dempsey's 63
That's where I was going to go with it.
63-yard
one 63-yard field goal.
Because what happened is the Bees got a hold
of the transmitter. That's right.
And you didn't know, if they had kicked it good or not.
Right.
And basically it came on the television screen that Dempsey hits, a new NFL record. That was great. Certainly Gilliam's run.
Yes.
Because it was the moment. You were a kid and you say, man, you really got it. We got this team rolling in the right direction. The other thing, too, was going to the playoffs for the first time in '87. You playing the Vikings. The first drive, Bobby J gets him there and he throws a touchdown, and it's 7-0. And you say, wow, man, this team is hot.
Yep.
And I know how good the Vikings are. But then Anthony Carter took over after that, and it was over with. But it was the lead up to that first playoff game, and Bobby hitting that touchdown, and you say, man, this team legitimately can get to the Super Bowl. And then the buzzsaw cut you with the Vikings.
No doubt. Mike Detillier, thanks for the hour.
Thanks so much,
Great
Eric.
hour, and again, a lot of great memories for all of us that grew up with Saints football.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember, there's a rebroadcast of this program each and every Friday night right here on WLAE at 10 p.m. Also on Pelican Sports Television in the New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Lafayette markets, 9 p.m. every Friday night. You can catch me on the radio, 990 a.m. WGSO, 11 a.m. until 1 p.m. weekdays. Also, the TuneIn Radio app is a great download for your smartphone or tablet. It is free, by the way. Also, you can check us out online at ericasher.com, where you can listen live, download the podcast. And all the previous episodes of Inside New Orleans Sports are at ericasher.com as well. Special thanks to Mike Detillier, also the WLAE production staff, including Ron Yeager, Jim Dotson, Donovan Joseph, Christian Medier, and my director, Naila Jones. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you right back here next week for another edition of Inside New Orleans Sports.
Inside New Orleans Sports with Eric Asher is the first place award winner of the 2015 New Orleans Press Club's Excellence in Journalism Award for the category of Best TV Sports Show.